Hi everybody, and welcome to week 6. This week and next week we focus in on reading comprehension, and this week we really look at the beginnings of that as learners move from phase 2 to phase 3. As you may remember from previous weeks, in her book Facts and Fads in Beginning Reading, Dina Feitelson laid out a 3-phase model for reading instruction. Phase 1, which we looked at last week, was pre-reading. This is what takes place before the onset of formal reading instruction. It's content-oriented and unstructured, meaning that it can focus a lot on the child's individual interests. It's designed to reach meaning through text. And the real hallmark of this phase is that the adults are the ones who do the actual reading. The children's primary obligation is to absorb the content and to absorb the language. It's really very language focused rather than reading focused. Phase 2, which we looked at actually 2 weeks ago, this deals with the onset of formal reading instruction. It's decoding acquisition. This is radically different from phases 1 and 3 because it is tightly structured. Nothing is left to chance, and it is designed to systematically build proficiency in decoding. Phase 3, which is what we're starting today, this is free unending reading development. This is post-decoding instruction. Like phase 1, it's content-oriented. It's unstructured, meaning it can focus a lot on the individual interests of the learner. It's designed to reach meaning through text. But the difference here is that the children are actually beginning to read independently. They're the ones who now are doing the reading. Feitelson's 3-phase model is really quite elegant, but it doesn't account for some of the difficulty that happens in the transition. Transitions are generally difficult. They're tough in life. They're tough in learning. Moving from basic math skills to, long division, that's a very difficult transition. It's also a huge difficulty for some students moving from basic decoding to full-blown reading comprehension. For many students, they master the basic decoding skills and then they are frozen. They have great difficulty making the leap across the divide to being able to understand what it is they're reading. That's true in first language reading. It's also very true in second language reading. Other students are willing to make that leap, take that leap, but I worry, like the student in the middle here, who's clearly making the leap, but I'm just a little concerned that she doesn't have enough amplitude or energy to make it all the way across that chasm, and is either going to crash into the wall and hang on for dear life, or is going to actually fall. And that can happen especially in a second language learning situation. What's necessary to really make this feasible for all the students is that it has to be facilitated by the teacher to provide a bridge from basic decoding to full reading comprehension. That's the illustration on the right. And that bridge consists of several phases. First, you have to build vocabulary. Now that means not just recognizing the word in print and being able to say it, but actually knowing what the word means. Vocabulary building is critical to first language reading comprehension and to second language reading comprehension. Having taught the vocabulary, it's then necessary to provide a lot of practice in reading and a lot of vocabulary review, and in particular to make all those activities really varied so that students don't get bored. Students become bored very easily. Variety really is the spice of life, and so it's important to provide lots of different kinds of activities. Once students have a good grasp of the vocabulary and can read it, it's time to move on to the text that incorporates all of that vocabulary. Now, typically speaking, you start with the text, you figure out what vocabulary you have to teach, you kind of work backwards from it. But the student perceives it as moving forward, so we're taking this from the student's point of view. And then, once they have had the opportunity to play with the text, to read it, to reread it a few times until they're very comfortable and are able to do so fluently, it's then important to incorporate some reading comprehension activities. This is true in first language reading, this is true in second language reading. And in the beginning phase, which we're looking at today, the beginnings of phase 3, there are some very basic, simple reading comprehension activities that are kind of classics. We'll be looking at those this week. It's also important to incorporate some writing activities that support reading and conversation skills. As the University of Texas model points out, it's totally appropriate to incorporate writing activities that are supportive of other language skills. That's a totally legitimate thing to do. And especially at the beginning of phase 3, I think it's totally appropriate to do that. As students move along, you begin to incorporate more and more activities that are more free-flowing in terms of writing and that are really designed to teach specific writing skills. And because Hebrew is root word driven and it's totally different from the way English builds vocabulary, it's really important to spend some time providing specific work for students with Hebrew root words, and in the beginning phase especially, so that they can identify what the root letters are. So with word reading and vocabulary building, it's important to remember that words are the basic unit of reading. It's just, you don't read if you don't know the words. And decoding then becomes reading when it's combined with understanding the vocabulary. So you can read the word sipur, but if you understand that the word sipur is a bird, you have now moved from decoding to reading. There are lots of ways to introduce vocabulary. Now I'm talking about introducing it. I'm not talking about drilling it to start with. This is how you introduce it. And those of you that have been in the methods course already have seen some of this in action. But there are 3 basic ways. One is through using pictures and realia to illustrate the word. This is a classic activity in direct method. It is my personal favorite way to introduce nouns and adjectives. It's a little harder with verbs, but it can be done with verbs as well. Verbs really work well with action. You introduce the verb by acting it out. That's from the method known as TPR, or total physical response. It's a very good way to introduce verbs, to get kids up and moving also, because that's a good thing to do in class. And the other way is through translation. And my basic rule of thumb is that I use translation only when there's no other possible way of doing it. Once vocabulary is introduced, as you see it's introduced here on a page, it needs to be practiced. There are a number of different things that you can do for practicing words. There are group activities, and I think that's always good in a classroom setting, is to get the kids working together. You can do games that involve the students all together, or you can break them into small groups and play other games, like a memory game, where the words are illustrated by some kind of picture, and the object is to match the picture to the word. Memory game is a classic education game. It's used in schools all over the place. It's particularly good for this kind of vocabulary review. You can also incorporate paper and pencil activities. Here again is a game, a tic-tac-toe game, that is useful for kids to play together with a partner. And you can also give them independent activities, things like crossword puzzles, word searches, hidden words, scrambled words, or in this case, matching the sentence to the picture that is portrayed. And sometimes more than one sentence will apply. So students get a chance to apply their full reading comprehension skills a little bit more. At this point, one moves from the individual words to the text, and incorporating reading comprehension activities is really good. There are a number of different kinds of reading comprehension activities. The one pictured here is a fill-in-the-blank, answer the question based on the items that are read in the activity above. As I mentioned before, Hebrew and English do not build words the same way. English words are built in a linear and contiguous fashion, meaning they may have prefixes that are added at the beginning or suffixes added at the end. You may even take two roots and combine them together to form a complex word, but you're not going to have things happening within the roots themselves. That's not the case with Hebrew. Hebrew roots are not contiguous. There are any number of occasions where the vowels inside the root will change because the form requires that. And there may even be infixes, which are letters that are inserted between the letters of the root, and that changes that, creates a new pattern. So for example, we have the word Baruch. Baruch means that U in the middle between the second and third letters of the root make it a passive present tense. Katuv follows exactly the same pattern, and in biblical Hebrew that would be a participle, but and it would be a passive participle, but in modern Hebrew it's a passive present tense version. It's consistent, it consistently works that way, but students often then have trouble when they see the word, they have trouble figuring out what the root letters are. And it's more complicated in Hebrew because of this than it is in English. So a lot of students struggle to separate the root letters from the affixes, and they need specific practice in how to do that. This is a deductive approach, would be to, give them the root letters and explain what they are, and then give them a lot of samples of words that are derived from those root letters and let them find the letters within each word. Another deductive approach would be to provide them with lots of examples and ask them to figure out what the root letters are. This works particularly well when the root doesn't have a yud or a vav in the middle or a hey at the end, letters that tend to vanish in certain forms. But if there are consistent 3 letters of the root that always show up, this is a great activity. Let them find the root for themselves. You can also color code root letters within words to promote a kind of inductive learning. You do that with let's say you're working with 3 or 4 different roots. Color coding those letters, those root letters, will help students see how they play out in all their different forms. And they'll be able to inductively come up with the rules for how this works. It's always best in dealing with this to provide both inductive and deductive activities, and typically inductive approaches are used first and then deductive approaches afterwards. Because we're talking about the very early stages of phase 3, it's also important to keep reading comprehension activities or tests of reading comprehension as simple as possible. These can include asking students to answer questions from the text, and those questions could be true-false questions, could be fill in the blanks where they have to only provide a short answer, or you could ask them to write a full answer to a question. You could ask them to match a picture to its caption or to select a sentence that describes the picture. You could ask them to create a title for the passage or to select a title from a list that you provide. You could ask them to take a passage and turn it into a skit or a dialogue. Or if the passage already is a dialogue, you could just ask groups of students to act them out. That's a very good demonstration of reading comprehension if the student can not only say the passage but put the action to it. Or you could ask them to write a reaction to the passage they've read or to actually create their own story. In fact, when I was in 2nd grade, I remember that my favorite activity in school was when we had vocabulary lists, and the teacher would sometimes assign us the option of writing a story that incorporated as many of the words from our new list as we could. And that's also a great activity to give to second language learners.